This is For Example, a podcast exploring perspectives of the global Cold War, brought to you by the graduate students of the History and Political Science departments of Texas State University and the staff at Alcac Library. This podcast is funded by a Humanities Texas grant.
Today we'll be interviewing Dr. Valencia on his recent 2019 book, Anti-Authoritarian Youth Culture in Francoist Spain. And Louis, please introduce yourself.
You just introduced me.
No, what you do?
Oh, well, I studied anti-fascist and fascist youth culture. So the things that I'm interested are in the ways that young people can change the world, either if you're a fascist or an anti-fascist, or just a regular person who is trying to figure out your own place in the world. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is how young people can change their social surroundings, even if it's not necessarily always through explicit marches in the street. It can be, right? But also trying to think about the everyday ways in which people can change their world.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty cool. From the start of the book, you bring that to us. You bring that to nowadays, trying to relate those youths back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, all the way to the 80s that you talk about, to different movements that you saw firsthand in Spain back in 2010. So it's pretty cool to see how that develops.
Yeah, a lot of that came from. So when I was working on my PhD, I was participated in the 15M movement in Spain and also Occupy Wall Street in New York. And so a lot of what I was seeing was young people doing things in the streets and also trying to figure out ways to organize their lives to be more activist in some way. And so I think like a lot of my research has always been inspired by the things that I see people doing even still in the world today.
That's cool. I'll leave a question on that for later.
Okay.
It's let's try to bring it on.
Okay, bring it back. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd like first to start talking about the research for this book, because you use a bunch of very different sources.
Yes.
Not very traditional, very things that don't seem to be easily accessible. Also, things that you might have to go hunting for, from comic books to nightclub posters. How was that? How was gathering those sources?
A lot of it is so a lot of queer culture and youth culture in general isn't saved in archives. It's not saved in libraries. And so if you want to get at those sources, oftentimes it's trying to find the people who participated in those cultures. And so a lot of what I had to do was I would go to like a archive and they said, "Oh yeah, we used to have those here, but then one of the security guards wanted those comic books and just walked out with them." And so it was this sort of question of like, okay, there's this material there that people are interested in, and it's just trying to figure out who has it. So it would be zines that young people would make, which are like photocopied sort of pamphlets that became really prominent in the 70s and 80s, particularly. Or it might be music, or it's doing oral history interviews with people. It's going to archives and seeing how the government tried to censor this type of publication. So it's a kind of a combination of all those things, but also walking the streets themselves and seeing how does the flow go down a given street. Mm-hmm. Like why would a particular plaza be more amenable for partying as opposed to somewhere else? And so it's a lot of kind of like I think more visceral type of research that has to go into that to be able to see, well, what were young people doing, talking to them, trying to figure out those little pieces that are almost more ephemeral.
That's so interesting. I never thought of like architecture as having any kind of contribution to like facilitating youth culture and everything. That's so interesting.
Yeah, and like so I would there's this one plaza in Madrid that I go to that in the book that I looked at the photos and basically is set up the same way that it is today. So architecturally, it hasn't changed in 40 years, which is something you have to like check on, right? But then you go there and you see like all of these benches that are built around the plaza where young people are sitting still. Since then, they've like put in these like gates to kind of keep kids from climbing on top of statues,
Oh yeah.
which was something that I found photos of. So there's all these sorts of elements of like how they try to control young people in those spaces, but also how young people try to make it their own as well. So it's fun to kind of find those little bits and pieces. A lot of newspaper research. Some of it was there's this one person I interviewed on that particular plaza that he was a photographer. He got really good photos of it, but he hadn't actually told anybody about what the day was like.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't really want to talk, but he said, I'll write it for you. And so he wrote down what his experience was. So, in a sense, created an archive for the book, which is also included. So it's kind of this just interesting. I always see like studying youth culture is like trying to find atypical ways to find these voices that are oftentimes not recorded otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember reading books where people were talking about going for months looking for folk songs that they couldn't find anywhere, looking for different types of these little things that nobody, I wouldn't say nobody cared to, but nobody thought about
Right.
recording. So it's an interesting thing. How long were you looking for those things?
So well, in some ways, the project started when I was an undergrad working on my undergraduate research thesis, which was on youth slang in Madrid during the 70s and 80s in the films of the director Pedro Almodovar. And so I started off with that and kind of was my first exposure to that culture. And the question I was asking myself is, how did it come to be? And there was no book about it. Nothing. And so as a grad student at Fordham, when I was working on my master's and PhD, we did sort of together, it was basically trying to figure out what had been done, what did I want to do. And at first I was really hesitant about like doing research on something that there wasn't a book on, right? That's a little scary. And so what I tried to do was just first semester of grad school, like just started trying to pull papers together that used some of the types of sources that I wanted. My advisor was really good at encouraging me to do what I wanted to do, which I think is really helpful. Sometimes professors want carbon copies. And what I really appreciated about my advisor, Christopher Schmidt-Mora, and then later Rosemary Wakeman as well, is that they really encouraged me to start with the theory, start with the questions, and then from there try to follow up with what I wanted to learn about. So it was just collecting over my time as a PhD student, basically. So from 2010 to 2016.
That's pretty cool because there's so many of us in undergrad that simply, seeing yourself in academia is kind of complicated. So
Yeah.
having people who incentivize you and, being able to look back now and be like, well, this research was possible because I had someone
Right.
to help me with that. So that's a cool thing to point out. That's great. Something else about before we get out of the sources thing
Okay.
that I found really interesting is that two things. First, you do mention I don't know if that's a joke or not, but you do say bad education several times in the book.
Uh-huh.
Is that a joke with Pedro Almodovar?
It is, absolutely.
Because I've seen that several times and I was like,
I have so many Easter eggs in my book that
yeah, I kind of realized that.
Yeah. There's Easter eggs all over the place. Comic book references, pop songs that you probably have heard of. It's pretty great. I'm not gonna lie. That was like the greatest joy of writing the book.
Yeah, because sometimes I was reading it and I saw a passage and I was like, well, if you say that in a different language, I can see the joke. I can see where it come from.
Yep, exactly. So I definitely littered the book with Easter eggs. I learned from Taylor Swift how to do that.
Well, that's cool. The second thing I wanted to ask about that is that you seem to have spent a lot of time on comic books also.
Right.
There's a whole chapter on the subject, and those seem to be like more of a sketchy thing to go around looking for, because you're not looking only for comic books. You're looking for very specific time wise and very specific like you talk about different writings on those comic books and that type of thing. So that seems like a lot of work on secondhand bookstores and little
Yeah.
bazaars and all. So how was that?
Yeah, so a lot of it was the comic books is talking to bookshop owners, and they would say, "This is what I'm looking for," and a lot of them were just like, "Okay, I'll be on the lookout." And so over the period of really years, they would say like, "Oh, I found this comic book that you might be interested in. It has some names written on it that you might be able to follow up on," or you would see like sort of these ways that they were also they were um, wanting to be a part of the project, right? The bookstores love the idea that the things that they're doing, selling books, can actually help make a book. And so that was kind of a cool sort of thing to be able to do with them. I also did work with this um, street vendor, that's the best way to describe him, known, that loosely translates as the Lone Ranger, is what he calls himself. Yeah, so speaking of like cowboys that we were mentioning before starting to talk, um, he had a massive collection of comic books and a whole team of people that he would try to sell comic books, and he'd been doing it for decades. So he was really helpful in just like gathering things. He was very kind of sketchy is a good word, in the sense of like you're like, I don't know where you're gonna get this, but he's like
Unaffiliated.
unaffiliated. It's like he always pulled through, so he helped me collect a lot of this material as well. Well, when I say help, he sold it to me, right? So he was helpful.
So you were that guy when you go into the shop and you're like, I might have a buyer for that.
Oh yeah, exactly.
That was
Yeah,
you.
that would be me. And they were really helpful, and it was all very like really fair prices too. It was just fun, honestly. Said we could talk about the he could talk about those comics in a way that was super helpful and helping me kind of connect the dots as well. And so it's a lot of that type of um, work that I think that oftentimes a lot of historians they go to the archive and they're just with their archives.
Yeah.
A lot of my research has mostly just been archives and intense communication with random people and them networking you with others. So it's kind of a good balance for me, at least.
Yeah. I feel like you really need that in academia too. And especially when you're dealing with something like youth culture and stuff, you need to like be out there amongst it. I also had a question about the comic books. So like I know also in academia we can be very pretentious.
Right.
Did you face any challenges when using that as like a legitimate source?
I think there were some fellow grad students
Yeah.
who were pretentious about that. None of the professors were. None
That's
of the
awesome.
people at conferences were. It was more like this thing that some people in my cohort were like, "Is that real history?" It's like,
Yes.
it is one, but also, if you look at just the numbers, more than 95% of young people in the period that I study were reading comic books. So to ignore that big of a uh, of a literature is the equivalent of somebody trying to study the 21st century today and ignoring social media for young
Yeah.
people. It would just be ridiculous. And so studying comic books makes the most sense for what I was looking at that time.
Well, talking about the comic books, bringing
Yeah.
that back to why we have comic books on this, right?
Right.
So something that's really prominent in your book with the comic books and other sources is about how this cultural imperialism from the United States penetrates into Spain during the Cold War as it aligns with the United States. So at the same time that it gets the security from being part of this Western idea of world,
Right.
it also gets all of these cultural institutions brought into Spain that kind of clashed with the projects that Spain had for its own youth.
Right.
So my question about that is not only comic books, but how does that happen in the sense of like timeline wise? Is that something that you can see from the beginning in the Franco regime, or something that happens through time, and when they realize, oh well, we have a different culture going on than what we thought we should have?
So really, that starts off in the 1950s when you have more military bases from U.S. military bases being set up across Spain, which was part of an agreement to open up trade to the U.S. Firstly, and then to the rest of Europe as well. And so what you see is these soldiers from the United States in these military bases across Spain bringing their own culture with them. And so at first it was sort of innocuous in that you had like them listening to rock and roll music, or it was a lot of different types of ideas of what women could do. So the male soldiers from the U.S. had different expectations of how to treat women than the Spanish who were living under the fascist regime, right? And so like those types of norms opened up a few opportunities for women, for example, but simultaneously it homogenized Spanish culture and made it more American than, which is the cultural imperialism that you're sort of referring to there. And I think like it's very haphazard, and that was one of the actual interests in the comic books was Superman comics were massively popular in Spain, just massively, and there was a lot of rejection of that by the Franco dictatorship, but not because Franco was like anti-American, but mostly because he didn't like Superman dressing up in tight, flamboyant clothing and having a double identity,
Interesting.
or Lois Lane wearing pants and telling Superman what to do. And so some of the ideas of this American cultural imperialism was not just like pop culture, but it was also the norms that were expected. So the dictatorship read Superman as gay and Lois Lane as a lesbian. And so it was this idea that American empire was importing these non-traditionalist ideas of the roles of men and women. And so you kind of get that. Simultaneously, you just have like massive amounts of just, um, we'll say, like rejection of these traditional Spanish cultural holidays, for example. And so these types of things become mixed in and sort of this combination of imperialism, but also people that were trying to do to become more young people that are trying to be more global in their perspective. And so all of it's kind of very messy in the 50s, 60s, and going through the 80s even. And it kind of in the book in sort of this like, and then we all became consumerists in Spain, and here we are. So
Happily ever after.
happily ever after. Capitalism won. Which I think, and that's sort of like the whole trajectory of the book was, okay, let's overthrow these traditionalist fascist ideologies, which they push against, and you get different varieties of queer liberation and feminism and all this stuff. But also, it just ends with now we're all consuming this popular culture that's been sanitized in some way, and so it's kind of like you've transitioned from fascist dictatorship to capitalist modernity. Which poison do you want?
Yeah.
Oh boy, I wonder what Franco thought about Batman and Robin in that case.
Oh my god.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, Batman and Robin they didn't even make it in. Like it was weird. Like
Hard stop.
Hard stop. There was no Batman and Robin. Yeah.
But that's cool that you brought that in, because when you talk about gender roles in Spain at this moment, we're not only talking about gender roles in Spain, we're talking about gender roles as they change throughout the century, and as some refuse to let it change. And as a surviving fascist dictatorship, it makes sense that Spain would be one of the countries that would be pushing against it the hardest.
Right.
And the reason I think that's pretty interesting is because we have a very powerful female figure in the Spanish government, in the Spanish regime, that's very contradictory in several ways. And you talk a lot about that in the book, which is Pilar Primo de Rivera.
Yes.
What do you make of Pilar in these 40 years that she outlived her brother?
So Pilar Primo de Rivera was the sister of the founder of the Fascist Party in Spain. And when her brother died, uh, essentially, she could have probably just like faded off into history, but she really took it sort of as her mission to continue the work of her brother and to make sure that her brother's lauded in going forward, right? And so she was prominent in education, particularly. So she tried to make sure that there was a fascist education program for young people. Made sure that her brother's image was in every classroom in Spain, and really was trying to, we'll say, keep this idea of like youth at the center of what is the regime. And she was really kind of unique in the sense that she was very pro women in the sense that she believed women had a very important role in society. She didn't believe that they should be locked away in the home necessarily, but they should dedicate their lives to the home. So
Interesting.
she, it was a very interesting combination of, she believed that all women should do some sort of social service for the country, but a lot of that was very nationalistic, right? So it's like women had their role within the fascist regime, and they shouldn't be locked away, but they need to remember that their number one priority is being a mother. And so like that's the interesting thing about her is that she actually never had kids and never married. There was an attempt to try to marry her off to Hitler at one point.
Power couple.
Yeah, that would have been rough. Hitler wasn't into that, I guess. But it's like more than anybody else in the country, she held the most power for the longest time, even longer than Franco, the dictator himself. So I think it's interesting to see that even in the midst of this fascist regime, you do have women that are very powerful, have an important role in society, but they're also very much so fascist. So it's like some sort of I think combination of those things is she was an exception to what was allowed for women, but at the same time she advocated for women to have a role in society outside of just the home.
That sounds very much like Gilded Age feminism and everything. When you have those rise of like middle to upper class women being like, oh, we need to go outside the home. We need to offer like all these charities and these like start the tenement homes and everything. But there's still that emphasis of like, oh, but you need to come home and cook dinner. Oh, but you need to come home and take care of your kids. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's and she lives for quite a while after the dictatorship falls. Even writes a memoir. Is prominent to the very end of her life within Spanish society, even though she wasn't. She was basically basing most of her power on her brother who died in the 30s, and she stayed in power 6 decades, essentially in some way prominently in Spanish society, as this traditionalist voice slash fascist, very much so a proponent of what was called national Catholicism. So if we think about it in contemporary terms, I think Christian nationalism in the United States is kind of an interesting parallel kind of concept. So it's turning the idea of Catholicism into a nationalist belief. And she was a big proponent of that. And she had her power and was fundamental in understanding how fascism actually played out through the dictatorship. Franco was a good old-fashioned authoritarian, first and foremost, who used fascism when it suited him. But she was a firm, like, full-on believer, and really shaped the education of millions of people in this fascist way.
Yeah, and as you said, she was in power before him, and she was in power after him.
Exactly.
She was there all alone, so she had this essential role in shaping what Spanish fascism would look like and what Spanish education especially would look like.
And even today, a lot of historians don't focus on her. She's almost left out of all the histories, and I think that's a really huge problem. I think it's probably because a lot of historians don't see her as being able to have had that much power during her life. It's sexism on the part of maybe many historians.
And even her wouldn't probably give herself that much power. She wouldn't tell that she had
Right.
that
She
power.
would just say that she's doing her duty to the country. But she also ran like the one of the most the largest organizations in the country that many women belong to, and organized the education. So I mean, like, very few people had as much power as she did. Very few men even had that much power.
Yeah, the education is always one of the most
Right.
disputed spheres of influence within fascist dictatorships, because we know that those are the people who are forming those who are gonna take over the mantle once the old guard is gone. So even if you look at Germany, you look at Italy, that's always a sphere of influence that's always on dispute. People are trying to get some hold on it,
Mm-hmm.
and for her to have it, it's kind of changes the whole
Right.
regime. So that's pretty interesting. And unfortunately, as you said, she's not as I wouldn't say as famous as her brother and her father, but she isn't as studied as they are.
Exactly.
It is very important to know the Primo de Rivera as a family to understand what is Spain.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about Primo de Rivera,
Yeah.
his presence throughout the 40 something years of Franco is always felt.
Right.
Primo de Rivera is, as they call it, the absent would be a good translation for that.
Yes.
How do you see that playing out in education? As you said, there's a triad of Franco, Franco, Jesus, and Primo de Rivera.
Exactly.
How did that play out in education?
We'll say that Jose Antonio Primo de Rivera, he's the founder of the Fascist Party, but also he legitimates Franco in a lot of ways. So if you cut out him, then the fascist ideologies that really set up Franco in the beginning disappear. But Franco is a national Catholic, right? So that's the Jesus part as well. So in some ways, I see those two, Primo de Rivera and Jesus, in some way being like the foundation that Franco is building his house. And so Franco is the father of the country, the person who's bringing Spain into the future, and so he uses both of them as like his justification for power, and he does it all the way until his death in 75.
So you see him as a stepping stone for.
I think he is. I think there would have been major issues had Primo de Rivera actually not died in the war. I think like there would have been a lot of internal conflict, but because he died, he became a martyr, and became a way of justifying what needed to be done to make Spain great again. Um, so in some sense, uh, we'll say like the one of Franco's mottos was España una grande libre, one great free. And so in his mind, in Franco's mind, that sort of idea of making Spain, the Spanish Empire, great again, was based on having these two things: Catholicism, which had long been part of the, going back to Isabel, the Catholic Queen of Spain, her sort of mantra, to this idea of like making Spain into the new modern country, which is a very fascist idea of what is the utopia. So I think like the two of those things were trying to harken back to this almost mythological past of great Spain into like this new future, is what Franco was trying to triangulate between those two figures, Jesus and Primo de Rivera.
And it also creates a good dynamic within that triad where you have God, the leader, and
Exactly.
the intellectual.
It's a very much so, it's a trinity, and it plays with the sort of way ideas that many people in the West organize their thoughts and ideas. Even I always find myself doing this. I'll make a list of there are 3 things that we need to do, and that's basically like this whole Trinity thing. Like in the West, we're like pre-programmed to like have think in threes, and so it's a very natural sort of way of using that idea to easily convey something to Spanish people.
That's so interesting. This might be a little off topic, but do you see any kind of similarities between that and then like kind of the rise of evangelicalism in America in like the late 70s, early 80s, and it's like strong ties to the conservative right?
I think that a lot of the times when you have any sort of economic distress, there's an attempt to try to find either a solution that's in the past or a solution that is trying to blame individual groups in the present. In the worst case scenarios, you get both of those things. And I think like that's what you see with a lot of far right groups. Either if we're talking about Spain in the 30s and 40s, or we're talking about the U.S. more contemporarily, is you try to find a scapegoat, and you try to say, well, what would our world be without that scapegoat? And if we could get rid of those people who are denigrating society in some way, then we will have our idealized past will return. And I think that's a very common trope in fascistic ideology and far right ideology as well. So with Christian nationalists today, absolutely, I think that that's part of that in the U.S. context.
Interesting. It's so weird how so much political ideology is spurred on by just nostalgia.
Oh yeah.
You know, like
yeah, absolutely. Mussolini wanted to make Italy into Rome again. Franco wanted to bring back the empire. Hitler was looking at the world before World War One in Germany. It's a common trope to look at these idealized pasts that really weren't that great if you look at them, but that's sort of what Franco's looking at the Spanish colonization and the expulsion of Muslims and Jews and the extermination of indigenous people as the time of greatness, right? So I think that a lot of those ideas for nostalgia for the past is sort of when we had power, or we felt secure in our power.
And all of that might seem weird for us, but when you have in mind that homogenizing society is part of their goal, then it makes more sense to look at those moments where you could do that more freely, I guess, without being felt that much backlash from your peers as a idealized moment. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Especially when you have Franco beginning his insurrection in Spain coming from Morocco.
Exactly. It's all based on things that logically don't play out or don't make sense with the ideology. And I think with a lot of fascistic ideology, there's always that internal contradiction. Hitler had queer people that were working in the military with him. Franco had people from North Africa who he promised citizenship to, helping fight in the war, that he also did not give citizenship to. So it's like these internalized contradictions that Pilar Primo de Rivera, she was a woman who was single, that didn't have kids, that was advocating for women to get married and have kids, right? So like these contradictions are all over the place when you look at fascist ideology.
And that shows up a lot in other chapters of the book where you're analyzing school books.
Yeah.
And you're analyzing the way these school books were made and what were the target publics for each of those books, and the way they're trying to teach this ideology in different ways for different ages, and depending on when these people were born. They were born before the war, during the war, after the war, much after the war, never experienced
the war itself.
War itself. And you mentioned that this war, the Spanish Civil War, is really the generational gap between those who went through it and those who didn't. plays a big role in creating all of these dissenting cultures within Spain. Could you elaborate a little on that, on how that war, the impact of it?
So for people that lived in the war and remembered the war, um, one of their primary goals was to prevent another war from happening, and so they're willing to be complacent with the dictatorship as long as they could survive. And so, in a lot of ways, the Civil War legitimated their oppression. They needed to prevent another violent outbreak like that again. Whereas younger people who had no memory of the war essentially were able to say, like, well, why do we have to live this way? They're looking at the US, they're looking at France, they're looking at England, and just seeing a totally different youth culture than theirs. And there's the legitimation is this war that they don't remember, that their parents don't even want to talk about. And so it creates this gap between young people saying, well, why should this thing that we don't remember, that our parents won't even talk to us about, dictate our life? And so, in a lot of ways, that's the definitive break where there was no historical memory that was being recreated to justify the dictatorship, because a lot of Spaniards simply just didn't want to talk about the war. And so, if you don't have people talking about it, then it's impossible to keep that legitimation coherent in some way.
That reminds me a lot of like kind of the thing between the silent gen and the boomers, and how silent gen, like if you're born in the 20s, your dad went to World War One, you lived through the Depression, and then you went to World War Two.
Right.
And so there's all that trauma there, and there's no therapy, and so
Right.
and but then with the boomers, like of course there's Vietnam, and that was a very difficult time, but in a very different way, and so there's these huge cultural shifts between the two. It's so interesting how that's so universal like that.
And I think like those are the types of things that I'm really interested in when thinking about how individual actions, when repeated in multitude, can really create a culture.
Yeah.
So something else that has something to do with that, but kind of separate. So the book touches on different types of dissent, not only generational differences on how dissent develops, but also according to nationality, gender, and class.
Right.
And I see that especially when you talk about academia and this more intellectual type of dissent that was happening.
Right.
Compared to, and that's more study, there's more literature on that than in everyday life.
Right.
So how those things develop separately, how they converge, especially by the 70s, 60s, and 70s, where you really see those things flourishing.
There's a lot of student activists in the 60s and 70s in Spain that were organizing very politically. They were from elite backgrounds, which I think is very important to understand why they were able to get away with this type of dissent. They framed it always around sort of issues of Catholicism, and this is what the Catholic Church is doing. This is why we need to move towards democratic ideas, and they framed it using a Christian Catholic framework. And so, like, whenever you have like those intellectual, educated young people from elite backgrounds, they know how to use those mechanisms in a way that I think if you're from a working class background and don't necessarily have all those tools, you go to something else. And so what a lot of younger people who were from working class backgrounds did was less of that, we'll say, elite sort of toolboxes, but instead they would make fanzines, they would make songs, they would use popular culture in a way that was more effective for them, and arguably more effective overall at changing the culture than sort of these elite ways of doing it.
And that, as you mentioned, at some point they're kind of incorporated by these elite
Yes.
as part of their identity also.
So by the 80s, those same people who maybe 20, 30 years earlier were from these elite backgrounds realized the way to get people to change their culture is start funding comic books. By the city of Madrid started paying for comic books, paying for concerts, paying for all these sort of youth events to teach people, young people, to be more democratic and pluralistic in their worldviews. And so the government, the socialist government, realized very quickly that was the key to sort of unlocking a lot of this.
And we see two trends on that when you see both this government trying to incorporate all of these things, but also we see all of these attempts to make that into um, commodities and try to get that culture in. As I think you talk a lot about that with the Movida,
Uh-huh.
which is the commodification of all of these different styles and ideas that were organically coming up, but then at some point became commercial.
Right. So the movida was the Spanish equivalent of the New Wave movement. So if you see it in France or the UK, even in New York particularly, so it's the Spanish version of that, but it's much more sexual than any of the other versions of it. It's very queer, very in your face, and it's very colorful. So it's all the aesthetics that people typically think about of new wave cinema or new wave music, but much more hypersexualized. And I think that's the conditions of Spain that had been so oppressive towards sexuality for so long that that kind of comes out. Um, but really, what ends up happening in this process of trying to popularize this music, these films, etc., it becomes commercialized, which in some ways was the goal, right? These artists wanted their stuff to be consumed and produced. Sometimes they produced it at cost, so it wasn't always the high profit margins that we typically think of the music industry or film industry today, but it was done with the purpose of selling it and was pretty successful at that. And so a lot of that youth culture that came out in the 80s that was rejecting fascist ideologies, was more pluralistic, etc., was also built on young people that were trying to make things and sell it and eventually get incorporated into these large multinationals like Warner Music or what have you.
And one example you give is with the movies and the cinema that kind of arises from the Movida. And you have Almodovar, you have all of these different directors and different screenwriters, and some of them move into becoming big stars and big
Right.
Industry people, while
yeah.
others fade away.
People like Antonio Banderas is probably one of the most famous people known in the United States from Almodovar's films. So Penelope Cruz, also very famous, comes from his films. So it's an industry that becomes global in a lot of ways, but also shows Spanish culture as progressive, especially sexually liberated, and I think that changes how people think about Spain globally as well.
And that's interesting because, as you also build in the book, that's something that is developed in an underground setting. It's developed in all of these spaces that are very mobile. They're very ephemeral in the sense that I think the word you use is appropriating spaces or reappropriating spaces that had been appropriated by the regime, and that's a big part of the book. This whole this whole spatial theory ideas that play really a big role in creating all these, as you call them, scenes. I think to close up, we're already an hour here.
Yeah.
How do you see the development of those spaces, development of those scenes in back in during the dictatorship, and how do you see it today? Do you see that happening today? Do you see that as something that continues to entice people to go and build something different?
So I'll start off with just like there's at some point in Madrid there was the first gay bar, right? And then other bars start to um, have more open policies where they might be dancing with music for the first time. That happens in the 70s. And then you start to see like people going to these bars because they know that they're safer spaces, right? Where they and some of these bars even got like bombed, like by
Wow.
fascist youth groups. So it's not that they were safe spaces, far from it in some cases. But eventually, what you get is people creating these scenes where they knew where it was okay to find people like them, and slowly over time, and this happens in a lot of major cities and all over the world, is you have these neighborhoods or things along these lines where a whole neighborhood might feel safer, right? Not necessarily safe, but safer. And then over time, if it's successful, a whole city can embrace those types of um, uh, respects for diversity and inclusion. And I think Madrid's definitely become one of those cities where it's more acceptable to be queer openly wherever you are in the city. Um, not all parts of the city, but many parts of the city. And so I think like that's sort of how you start off with something being underground to being sort of more a neighborhood to being a general sentiment for a city. And I think the more that that happens in any individual town or city, the more likely it is that you will create a place of inclusion, pluralism, and that's a long term thing, right? It doesn't happen in 5 years. It happens over decades.
That's so cool. And like just the like that all sounds like punk rock to me.
I mean, it is.
Yeah.
It's definitely punk rock. It's
And it reminds me so much of like in England and punk rock in like the 70s and 80s under the conservative government of Margaret Thatcher, and that's just I don't know, that's just so cool. That
I was in Manchester this summer, and home of punk rock, like in my mind. New York would have something to disagree, but like Manchester's like pretty hardcore punk. It's great, but it's definitely those spaces that continue, right? Like you go there and you still see how underground culture still flourishes. It's been sold and packaged, and it's part of this consumerist world that we live in. But in some ways, some of those ideologies are still holding, right? Which is something.
And Spanish punk is an interesting genre in itself.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other whole other genre, whole other podcast episode.
Oh yeah, no, I'm a fan.
Yeah, same.
Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's great.
And we'll cut those
Cut.
parts out.
All right, sounds
And
good.
do you have anything before we go? Do you have anything you'd like to plug?
What do I have to plug? I'm working on my upcoming book on Harry Styles and the Cult of Celebrity, which is forthcoming. So look for that sometime in the next year or so.
Very exciting.
Yeah,
That's pretty cool. That one blew up.
that one blew up. That one definitely blew up.
Well, thank you again.
Thank
yes,
you.
Thank you.